Joseph R. Brown could well be called the father of Minnesota. In every period of his life, he certainly had a great effect upon upon his neighbors, upon his fellow citizens, upon everybody else in the territory, the Indians, the politicians, and settlers.
And I think about as much influence on how Minnesota came out as any person did.
Never actually stuck to the same thing all the time. He always seemed to be the same old Joe Brown, but doing something else.
So he joined the Army. He was 15 years old and got shipped out here to Fort Snelling, where he stayed for several years. He was in the Army for 8 years. Of course, at Fort Snelling, they were surrounded by the Dakota villages, and so he knew very well, you know, the people that lived around there. And when he got out, he was down at Fort Armstrong, Illinois, and went into the fur trade business right away. The Mississippi River was a dividing line at this time. That is, it was all Indian country. To the west of that, you could not set foot in that country if you were not a licensed fur trader, or you had to otherwise be with the military. So if you want to stay and you're married to a girl there, you might want to look into getting to be a licensed fur trader, and of course he did.
His wife was an Indian woman, part Indian woman, who spoke Dakota around the house.
I think he must have spoke quite a few Indian languages, or knew enough to get along with them, you know. One of his early transportation feats was running a cart, an oxen cart, through from Prairie du Chien up to his little site at Oliver's Grove, which is now Hastings. Every other industry, every business out on the frontier required transportation.
Henderson would be a convenient spot on the river. The river is sort of the backbone of the transportation system.
Joe really considered Henderson to be the head of navigation. He owned a steamboat and other smaller boats. And one of the first roads, I believe, in the territory was the Fort Ridgely Road, which was somewhat improved, basically, by him and the citizens of Henderson. And Joe conceived the notion that a steam engine, a locomotive in other words, that could run on land, would be much cheaper in the long run than all these oxen. He positioned it as a machine that could haul all the Indian goods out there.
To find out something about the pre-territorial history of Joseph R. Brown, you're essentially going to have to look at Wisconsin stuff.
He went to the legislature in Wisconsin and demanded that they would have a new political government. They would have judges, they would have courts. People didn't have to go to Prairie du Chien for everything. I even call a turning point in his life when he had, you know, hey, we can do things in politics. He did some lobbying and got this county erected. And it was the county of St. Croix in those days. It's on both sides of the river, but at least it was the first government here, north of Prairie du Chien, basically. So there's a first right there. There's a good reason to pursue Mr. Brown. Is how did he do these things?
Joseph R. Brown was the Justice of the Peace. He was the clerk of the county board, register of deeds, representative in the legislature, contractor to build the courthouse, owner of the town site.
Assistant marshal, too.
Oh, assistant.
And in the militia.
Assistant United States Marshal and chairman of the local Democratic Party committee.
Yeah.
Joseph R. Brown could well be called the father of Minnesota. He had a lot to do with the first local government in Minnesota. He was the first elected representative from what is now Minnesota. He had a lot to do with setting up the original territory. Some people claim that he suggested the very name Minnesota. When the time came to have a state, he helped write the Constitution.
Well, I think when we moved to Stillwater here was when we really got interested, because this is probably known as his first town site. He called it Dakota. His original town on Great Cloud Island, that fell to the 1857 Depression. He moved into St. Paul for a while, but while he was doing that, he was founding Henderson, later on Browns Valley.
We ran across early on a little advertisement in the Lancaster, Pennsylvania newspaper about a runaway apprentice to a newspaper man, and he had gone off, disappeared. He was not to be trusted in anything he may say. The newspaper man was going to teach him how to set type, which is a very valuable bit of knowledge in those days.
And he was the public printer, and he operated the Pioneer and then the Pioneer and Democrat for several years. Then he founded his own newspaper down in Henderson. And within a few years, 60,000 people are here, and they're all getting into this new Indian land that has been ceded. And I think Joe really felt he could do something with the Indians on the reservation and keep the settlers and the Indians away from each other, so to speak.
Assimilationist in dealing with the Indians wanted to believe the Indians didn't have to be pushed on forever and ever, that there was a hope for them here in Minnesota. He was also awaiting appointment as Sioux Indian agent.
Apparently he actually did pretty well at that. The Indian War broke out after he had left, and his family was taken prisoner. He quickly came to Minnesota to see what he could rescue his family, and from that point on, that was the priority. The man who was trying to save the Indians who hadn't been involved in the uprising, and he was also the man who was chasing with Sibley the Indians that had been involved, trying to bring them to justice, as they would say today. The winter of 1862-3, the Indian prisoners were held at Mankato, and he was in charge, superintendent of the prison. He was in charge of the execution, as it turned out, of the 38 Indians. That is, he beat the drum, somebody else dropped the trap. He was the juggler. You wanted it done, he got it done. He's been in this territory the longest. He come here, and 50 years he's been right here. So they looked upon him as that father figure, I think, the man who you'd go to find out what had happened. And everybody knew who old Joe Brown was. The newspapers would just have to say, the juggler's in town, and everybody knew who it was.
You could call him a promoter and developer, or in other words, a pioneer, to get more business, to get more settlement, to get more transportation. He was not afraid to try something new. Some of them worked just fine, some of them didn't.